Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang namasami. So with a little bit of a follow-on from last week, I mentioned that the Buddhist teachings is very simple. It's really the path to selflessness. Of course, there are various ways other ways you can explain that. The usual ones are the path to Nibbana, the path to liberation, the path to the cessation of suffering. But I'm sure we've all heard those before. But maybe the path to selflessness is something new. Maybe it gives us a new reset on the Buddhist teachings, our approach to it. I think it's important to keep the goal in mind, the real purpose of the Buddhist teachings, because it can so easily get diluted. We find so much around it goes under the banner of Buddhism, but is it really? There's so many other little, they're worthy things, but it's not really what the Buddha was talking about. Building greater temples and what else? All kinds of things. They're very worthy things. I remember I had a remembrance of going to a temple once in South Thailand. I think I was still a novice, so it was very, very early on, and I was very surprised to go to this temple because it was basically a herbal remedy monastery. All the monks were busy making medicines. And what I can remember from what my Thai monk friend was explaining to me, that the Ajahn had very good samadhi, so he was meditating, and these Devatas contacted him, started telling him all these remedies for different ailments. So he got really, really excited about this, and he started prescribing medicines for people, and eventually the whole monastery was set up. All the monks were busy drying herbs and pounding herbs and mixing herbs and stuff like this. That was the main purpose of the monastery. It was a medicine monastery. That it does reduce suffering. I don't think it'll end up in the cessation of suffering completely. It does reduce suffering. But here this Ajahn even had good samadhi, but he was using it to talk to Devatas to get medical remedies for people. Is that what the Buddha was talking about? And I had read the Vinaya already, and that's why I was a novice, because I recognized I couldn't keep the Vinaya rules. It was too many first. I knew that in any Vinaya rules it says the monks should not get involved in making medicines for lay people. I think the story was that some monks did make medicine for somebody and they died. So the Sangha was criticized. We're not qualified doctors, but this whole monastery is set up just to provide medicine, and I don't know hopefully he didn't charge people for it. Didn't make money out of it, but it kind of missed the whole point, of, does this lead to selflessness? Maybe for some people. But if you don't keep that in mind, the real purpose of the Buddhist teachings, you can very easily just forget. As the saying goes, you can't see the forest for the trees. You get caught in the details, especially when it comes down to everyday practice. Trying to apply the Buddhist teachings to everyday practice. There's so many little details we have to work at. Trying to make our life simple, and trying to keep the precepts, and trying to speak properly and do the right thing, and forget that The whole purpose of this is towards selflessness. And to put it very simply, as I instruct the teachings I gave in the Rains Retreat, the path to selflessness is the Eightfold Path. Very simply, morality, meditation, wisdom. Maybe when we look at those principles we heard about so many times before, from the point of view of selflessness, maybe we see them differently. For example, morality, sila, usually translated as morality, but we translated it as skillful living skillfully in order to realize selflessness. Otherwise, most people think of morality, there's a set of rules to follow. You just got to follow these rules. And some people, I'm sure they do. They follow these rules and they're very strict about it, and maybe become very conceited about it. I keep the 5 precepts spotlessly. So they end up becoming more conceited, not selfless, and become more selfish, or criticize other people. They become critical of other people who don't keep the precepts strictly. Just laying their trip on other people. Very selfishly criticizing other people for not keeping the precepts. Or if you just think it's about following a bunch of rules, you kind of miss the point. Why are you following these rules? Well, because the Buddha told me to. Because if I keep the rules, I'll go to heaven. Is that selfless? I'm going to heaven because I keep rules? You're creating another ego, you're creating another self, the spiritual self. He thinks they're going to go to heaven because I keep some rules. And I keep better than everybody else. Maybe you recognize the whole point is towards selflessness, then you look at these particular guidelines, then refrain from killing. Refrain from killing because killing is an extreme example of selfishness. Denying somebody else of life, taking somebody else's life is ultimate in conceit, isn't it? I say that you can't live. That's incredibly arrogant and conceited and selfish. But to allow even unpleasant people, unpleasant animals to live requires quite a bit of self-surrender. So it's when you see it that way, then that's why it's not a matter of just keeping that rule, but there's a purpose behind it that it will help encourage or increase a level of selflessness, self-surrender. Same with stealing. Stealing is a very selfish act. It's for me. I'm taking it for myself rather than sharing. Generosity, giving up, requires it's a more selfless act. Generosity and sharing rather than taking and stealing. Same with the other precepts, but we see them in the right context now. And then sometimes we have to, situations don't fit into these categories exactly. You sub the precepts, you're trying to figure out, how does a precept apply to this particular thing, Like there's situations where, where it's very, you can't really say it's stealing, Like somebody asked me about this case. They were working in a company somewhere, and it was just common practice for people to, remove pens from the company and writing paper, and just taking little things, taking them home with them, you see. And then she found out about the Buddhist precepts, and she felt really guilty about this because it was taking things not given to her, she said. She said, should I go to go to the boss and apologize or offer to reimbursement? And probably, the average boss would think he's a bit crazy, I want to reimburse you for all the pens I've taken over the last 5 years, But she was really applying that principle, to the letter, But in society, in that company, stealing pens, borrowing pens permanently, borrowing writing paper permanently was not looked upon as being against any kind of rule. It wasn't stealing at all, But if everybody in the company, borrowed a pen permanently, the company's out of pocket, isn't it? They didn't give it to you. So there's some areas like that which are in gray, It's not considered to be stealing according to the standards of society, but, to your conscience, you're taking things not given. That's what it is. Adina dana. Dana is giving, you see. Adina dana, taking things which are not given to you. So it was obviously, she was reflecting upon these rules, these principles, these 5 precepts, and, oh yes, it wasn't appropriate, And it was maybe, people would maybe say, well, the company doesn't pay me very much money, so I'm entitled to it. Entitled to a few perks like stealing pens, and things like this. It's nothing, to them. Big company anyway, so. But, it's up to your conscience, Then when you try to develop meditation, refined awareness to your states of mind, maybe you notice some of these things. I recognize this is not very comfortable. It gives me I have a few guilty thoughts at night, or in meditation maybe. Well, the whole point of keeping the precepts was to support samadhi, right? Sila supports samadhi, supports wisdom, supports panya. So leading a blameless life, and with the principle of recognizing this is towards selflessness, to let go of the self and its concerns and its worries and its attachments, identification. We have a new perspective, new way of looking at, say, the precepts, the guidelines for skillful living. How to live our life in a skillful way which will support selflessness. And it's a developmental process too. Sometimes you just say, okay, well, like in the precepts, people keep the 5 precepts as a standard, but sometimes, you increase it to 8 precepts. And then maybe you forget, 8 precepts. I've got a gold badge now, a silver badge, because I got 8 precepts. 5 is just the brass one, but 8 is silver. And of course, the monks' rules are gold. Platinum. Novice is gold, and then monks are platinum, But if you recognize, and sometimes maybe you recognize that, okay, say, listening to music or something, and then you think, oh, well, it's no big deal, it's not 5 precepts, But then if you notice that what it does to your mind, there was one of the nuns in England, and she had been a rock musician previously before becoming a nun, but then it kept recurring in her mind. So it was just going on all the time, music being played in the back of her mind all the time when she's meditating. So when she put it into good use, that she could chant very well, even without a bass guitar, but she had a good rhythm or harmony or something, or chanting. But it did reverberate through her mind, you see. And so, maybe music does that too. There's some maybe some music is quite relaxing or whatever, calming, but at a refined level, does it really, what does it do to your mind? And maybe maybe it's relaxing at one level, but at a more subtle level of the mind, it does stir up the mind. I remember one of our supporters in Switzerland, she was actually she got interested in us in Buddhism through her Hindu guru. And in their practice of Hinduism, teacher had taught her a mantra. She had this mantra chanting going on in her mind. And she came to a retreat, and after a few days, I said, okay, now you can drop your meditation object and just observe where the mind goes. And then she got a bit of a start. She got a bit of a shock, actually, because she realized she couldn't turn the mantra off. The mantra was meditating her. She thought she was using mantra to calm the mind, But then it was going on so often and so repetitively, and she became so dependent upon it, I guess, attached to it. She couldn't turn it off. She couldn't stop the mantra chanting away in her mind. So it was very good in the beginning. Same as I found I was told in the very first lesson of meditation in Sri Lanka to count the breaths. To count the breaths as I was following the breath. Inhalation 1, in exhalation 2, inhalation 3, 4 up to 10, go back to 1 again. And it was very helpful in the beginning because my mind was so busy and so distracted. But after a couple of years, I noticed that my mind is still distracted, but here I'm also counting numbers too. 1, 2, 3. And it wasn't following the breath anymore. I was just too busy counting. It'll be 2 more years to stop the counting. Get back to the breath again. Just the experience of breathing. But in the beginning, it was very helpful. It did work in the beginning, but sometimes there are just stages we have to go through. But in this, looking at the Eightfold Path, the skillful living, we see that in the context of living in a skillful way to support selflessness. Perhaps it gives us a wider view of not just the precepts, but a wider view of how to live our life selflessly. So hopefully it can give us some, bit more breadth and depth in how we live our life. Not just measuring against the precepts, but about really the selflessness. And like I say, sometimes, keeping the precepts can increase selfishness. You find yourself getting very proud about it, or thinking that because you kept the precepts so long, so many years now, you're safe. Now you've entered the stream or something, because I'm so say, conditioned to keep the precepts, I must be a real serious Buddhist then. But then again, you're very proud of yourself. Look at how great a Buddhist I am. I'm keeping 5 precepts all these years. And I get a special star for it. And then it comes to samadhi practice, and samadhi, in reference to the Eightfold Path, samadhi has 3 factors to it. There's right effort, right mindfulness, and right collectedness. But the word samadhi many times has just been referred to as basically concentration. That's why I say collectedness, because actually concentration is only one factor of collectedness of samadhi, actually. But people forget that, sometimes you just think, okay, samadhi is just sitting there focusing your attention your mind just can get focused, but it can get very dull too. Whereas if you recognize, for example, the first factor, right effort, back to skillfulness again, to eliminate and prevent the arising of unskillfulness, to develop and sustain practice of skillfulness. That's also meditation. Samadhi is also part of meditation practice, skillfulness. As I mentioned about developing, the exercise of collectedness, for example, that if we just think of it as just concentration, many times we miss the supportive conditions for it. Just like well-being. Many times it's mentioned in the scriptures about a continuum, a causal sequence. And before samadhi, before collectedness, there is well-being, happiness, sukha. Sukha is a conditioning factor of concentration. So many times, I recognize myself, I forgot that many times. I was just trying to, focus attention, just focus attention. And sometimes it was very, very unpleasant, hard work, trying too hard. And most of the time, sometimes my mind did get focused, but it was very, very tense focus. It didn't last very long because there's no well-being behind it, no grounding in well-being. I just remembered recently about one time I was in northern Thailand. So I had my own hut, and I could make my own schedule. In Ajahn Chah's monastery, there is usually a program, a schedule set up, but when I was in North Thailand, there was no schedule in the monastery. I made my own schedule. So after midday, after the meal, and after a midday rest, I'd have my cup of tea, and then I'd start my meditation practice, sitting and walking. And one day I was sitting there, and it was quite pleasant. Looking out the window at the trees outside, and screens on the window too, so I had no mosquitoes in there. But the mind just wouldn't calm down. Just everything seemed to be quite all right. I didn't have my food was already digested. I didn't have a heavy stomach, and it wasn't really hot. But the mind just blah 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 back to the breathing, blah 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 blah, just went on and on and on. Got up, walked around, sat again, blah 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 blah. Finally, it was just really frustrated. Here I was trying so hard, it just didn't work. So finally, I don't know, after about an hour or so, or 2 hours, I don't know, but okay, I need a break. So I just got up and opened the door and looked outside, and it was quite pleasant outside, sun shining, and that's what I thought, okay, I'll just step out there and sit down a bit. There's a little bit of a concrete ledge around the building, around the kuti. So I just sat there and leaned against the wall, just a 5-minute break, and it was no mosquitoes around, and not too hot, very pleasant. And I was looking at the sun shining through the leaves, making these patterns of sunlight and shade, and I just sat there, just kind of gazing at it, and I noticed my mind is really quiet, without even trying. Isn't that interesting? Here I've been sitting there for 2 hours trying to make my mind peaceful, trying to focus on breathing, and walked outside and sat there and just relaxed, and it was so quiet. Of course, it didn't last that long. But there were other conditions, of course. It was, there was a physical ease. It wasn't hot, no mosquitoes. It was just relaxing physically, and it was not making any great effort. It was relaxing, and so the mind just went very, very quiet. But then after a little while, half an hour later, an hour or so, then a few thoughts came up. You should get back to your meditation cushion again. You should be wasting time sitting here. You should be doing something. You should get enlightened. So, it wasn't quiet anymore. But those moments you can't really create. You can't really create, nothingness, I guess you could say. But recognizing when you're trying too hard, it stirs up the mind, makes the mind restless and tense. Whereas, the collectedness as an experience requires, they say the first absorption requires 5 factors. 5 factors need to come together. And key to it is well-being. Initial and sustained thoughts, piti sukha, joy and well-being, and then one-pointedness of mind. Just having one-pointedness of mind, trying to get that, isn't enough. You need other supportive conditions too. They come together, and then you can say samadhi happens. A little bit of a balancing act. And then in the development of meditation, I'm not sure, I'm not a historian of religion, but I think in the the Buddha was probably one of the first, anyway, first teacher of note to give real important emphasis to sati, attentiveness or mindfulness. Because of his emphasis, of course, on wisdom, attentiveness was also associated with clearly knowing, sati sampajanya, attentiveness and clear knowing. But it's clear knowing from seeing things as they are, being attentive, seeing clearly. When you see clearly, then you know clearly. So the Buddha gave quite a bit of a prominent emphasis to that as a meditation practice. And there is a real significant principle behind it, behind collected attentiveness, because when one is attentive to something, you say one can objectify it. Normally, most of the time, we have an underlying disposition to self-reference everything. A feeling arises, and then immediately, sometimes we say quite, overtly, "Oh, I feel happy." Or at the very least, there is a subtle identification with it. Oh, happiness. Oh, that's nice. And we immediately self-reference it. But when you're observing it, you're observing feeling, as you do with the practice of attentiveness, mindfulness, then you can short-circuit that. You become the observer of the feeling, not the feeling. Not the identification with the feeling, you become the observer of the feeling. There's actually a developmental process. First of all, it's, the usual person is, "Oh, I'm feeling happy." And then when you begin to practice attentiveness, then there is, "Oh, I'm observing my feeling." Okay, oops, still got my in there. There's two eyes there now. There's I observing and I feeling. But you keep developing this sati, and then it's just observing feeling. No more my feeling anymore. You might notice it's a very subtle shift. Just observing feeling, arising and passing, arising and passing. But there's still identification with the observer of it. So I'm observing feeling. And you develop sati, even more energy into it, more development of it. It becomes just observing. Nobody observing, and nobody observing their feeling. Just observing feeling. Feeling arising, passing away, and it's not self. Just arising and passing. This phenomena, this mental function of feeling, arising and passing, arising and passing. Belonging to nobody even observing it, just is the process of observation. And if one can abide there, this is like what the Buddha was teaching, Bahya, just in the seeing, just the seeing, in the feeling, in the hearing, just the hearing, and the experiencing, just the experiencing. Nobody making reference to self-referencing it, not creating another self in it. But of course that has to function at different levels within our being too. We can know about it intellectually, but without the support of collectedness, which helps us to sharpen the mind, to deepen the penetrative insight, then it only stays on the surface. We know this, yes, but we don't actually really see it very deeply in our being. And still there's a subtle identification there. Background. So trying to put these two together, collectedness with attentiveness, put them together. Collectedness gives the broad view of the different ranges of, ultimately the five groups of grasping, the very sources of our identification of self. Five groups. To be aware of them, to be attentive to them. That's one of the exercises in development of attentiveness. And then samadhi, collectedness, provides the insight, the very deep seeing into it at a very deep level, the deep focus of it. Come to wisdom, the wisdom part. And again, if we see the development of wisdom in terms of selflessness. Because many times, at least at university, for example, I went for a few years, the wisdom, the learning, the knowledge could be a very conceited thing. And people were scrambling to become the great scholar, the great academic, the great wise person. So they're learning to bolster the ego, basically, rather than learning about the ego, about yourself. When you begin to turn your awareness towards the nature of the self, it should become very humbling. Recognize, the self is, you see its detrimental side. You get too caught up with it, you become a prisoner of it. It takes you over, it becomes inflated, self-inflated. You begin to observe that the self is the cause of so much suffering in our life, a major source of suffering. Worrying about the self, thinking about the self, me this and me that. So the more you try and, you get inflated with the self, the more you try to bolster the self, the more problems you have ultimately. Now you talk about, in one of the scriptures it mentions there's three kinds of wisdom, or three sources of wisdom, actually. You can say kinds of wisdom, I guess. The first one is just thinking, your own thinking about things. But you can recognize that that's quite limited, because thinking is still, circles around the self. I can only think as far as I've learned, or maybe, first you think as far as you can imagine. My goodness, you can go crazy probably. but at least you think with what you've learned and what the knowledge you have within your sphere of understanding, still quite limited. And the second one is sutta mayapanya, which is what literally means what we've heard. Because in the Buddha's time, in order to get some information, some knowledge, some instruction, they had to go to a person and receive it from them personally. They had to instruct you verbally. There were no books around to read. So you can say now what you can say rather than just what we heard, what we study. What we study or learn from outside. So for example, I never knew anything about Buddhism with my own sphere of knowledge that I got from my parents and my school. It wasn't until I went to university and picked up a book on Buddhism. Oh, there's this view of things too. I had these theories about the meaning of life, and about I heard the word karma before, so I had these views about karma. But then I came across a book on Buddhism, and this is a new way of seeing things. And at first I was quite surprised. Well, I was pleasantly surprised, because to me it was very scientific. And mostly the religion I heard before was sort of believe in this kind of supernatural spirit that nobody's seen before. Your fate is controlled by him. Nobody's seen him yet. But here in the Buddhist teaching, it was very scientific, cause and effect, laws of nature. So then, it expands your horizons more. But then the ultimate wisdom comes from mental development, bhavana mayapanya. It's one thing to have that information, and it was very, very tempting, especially at university. My mind was very busy. I recognized you couldn't stop it. And then the Buddha talked about peace of mind. Oh, this sounds wonderful, peace of mind. Where can I buy that? Oops, you can't buy it. Got to work on it yourself. But here are the steps. Here are the steps you follow. Okay, it can be done then. It's not impossible. You have to do it yourself. You have to practice these exercises in focused attention, in attentiveness. You can't buy them from any store. You can't, get them from anybody. You have to practice it yourself. But it is possible. So then, now I have to find a place to do this exercise. At that time, there was no teachers in Vancouver, so the only possibility was I had to go to Asia to find somebody to teach me meditation. And I just fortunate that it worked out that way. Just found myself one day in Sri Lanka, long story, and the man I was with was going to a monastery. So I thought, well, maybe I'll tag along then, it's something I have in mind too, go to a monastery. It's my bucket list, So he had a letter of invitation actually to a monastery, so I'll just tag along to it, with him, see. So I went to the monastery together, and then it was just the start of my meditation practice then. But to be seen in terms of, the whole point of wisdom is for selflessness. I mean, sometimes your way of thinking maybe can kind of approach selflessness to some degree, but thinking is still part of the self. Still part of your soul. Think about yourself. Still enclosed by the self. Maybe when you hear some new information, it does really challenge yourself. Pulls you outside of, the possibilities of yourself. Possibilities you never thought were possible before. And then meditation is only the ultimate type of wisdom, which will really, is a possibility then to transcend the self completely, seeing through it. It's not a matter of forgetting about the self. I mean, some people, when I first learned meditation, I thought it was just about collectedness, just focused attention, forgetting myself basically, losing myself in just a blank mind. And it worked for a while, it works for a while, but then you wake up again and oops, here I am still. And after a while, oh yeah, right, those thoughts and those memories, and you're back to yourself again. The Buddha did say it was a temporary abiding in peace. So it was useful. It was useful to have that experience, to recognize that the self was not a permanent ultimate reality. That's where you put your mind. You can go into yourself and think about yourself till you're crazy, or you can just put it on hold sometimes. There are ways to do that. Take a break from yourself. But the Buddha realized that it was only temporary until you can see the very nature of the self. You see that there isn't any thing there isn't anything, ultimate thing called the self. There's just these expressions, these processes. There is bodily sensations and feelings and memories and mental activity and consciousness. And that's what's there. You look at it more clearly, more precisely. Otherwise, within that, where is the self? As we become aware of those things, and then we add the extra little bit, identification with it. Reach out and grab it, grasp it as a self, to hold on to it. But it's not real. It's all a charade. It's all just a show. We have to be able to see that. And of course, being able to see it very clearly and very deeply requires mental development, more increased attentiveness, increased collectedness. The self has been with us from the moment we're born. You can even say, psychologists say you have a sense of a self even in the womb. And of course, in the Buddhist tradition, they say you had a self for many lifetimes already. Many lifetimes you've been coming back again to get reborn again. So the self is a very persistent fellow or female. Been around for a long time. It doesn't want to let go easily of its prominent position in your life, you say. But if you refine your awareness, look more carefully, say sati sampajanya, attentiveness and clearly knowing, be able to see that, just those qualities, you begin to see through it without all the self additions to it, all the proliferation, all the elaboration, all the self stories we add to it. Just feeling. Not my feeling, not my wonderful feeling, not my feeling I had last year. Just a feeling as a function of the mind, arising and passing away, arising and passing away. It's easy to see it. It's easy to say it, but not so easy to see it. Yeah. And that's why the Buddha, gave these instructions, and he gave many exhortations to meditate, to develop those qualities of attentiveness and collectedness, to be able to see it. Those are the real valuable tools to use, which we have the possibility to develop, to be able to see through it. Just thinking about it, analyzing it, philosophizing about the self, no way out of it. You might get some, refined attitudes or views about it, but never be able to see through it. The liberation only comes when there is the wisdom, the profound wisdom based upon collectedness and sila. Skillful living, collectedness, samadhi, and attentiveness, and then those applied in the right way, with the perspective of selflessness, impermanence, unsatisfactoriness, selflessness. Reflecting on those, most people, it's maybe their way to approach it is through impermanence, is noticing how this feelings, for example, states of mind are constantly changing. And in the scriptures, there was a very familiar dialogue which the Buddha had with inner monks. He said, is the body permanent or impermanent? And the monk said, well, impermanent. And he said, well, what is impermanent? Is it pleasant or unpleasant? Well, it's unpleasant. And what is impermanent, unpleasant? Is it correct to say it's yourself? It's your permanent self then? Well, of course not. Well, then, let it go. But the more that we're able to see that, in different, in a consistent way in our life, and with some degree of depth also. Say the sense of self is functioning at different levels, and so you can think about it. Oh yes, it's impermanent. Yeah, I realized that very early on. Oh yes, the body's impermanent, the feelings are impermanent. Yes. Before I ever did meditation, I could recognize it logically, but be able to see it took a lot more practice, a lot more energy in practice, to be able to actually see it more often. And still people forget about it, still forget sometimes, and still my body still hurts. It's impermanent, right? But it's not my body, right? But it still hurts. But keeping that in mind, keeping the principle in mind, selflessness, that's the main purpose of the Buddha's teachings, and get in the right context then, hopefully we'll be able to get another perspective on it. So that everything we do, our way of living, our meditation practice is hopefully supporting this realization of selflessness, that become a really living example of what we know and see and live with all the time then. So be able to keep that in mind, keep that as a focus of our practice, and keep that as a main priority of what we're here for. And hopefully you'll be able to experience that for yourself and recognize the benefits therefrom.
Annayam Namavargata Sadhu Karanamase Sadhu Sadhu